Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, hear you loud and clear.
Great.
Hear you fine.
Okay. Good. Okay. All right. So we're on 51A. We are about how many lines down? 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down in the middle of the line. And we continue to discover this corpse dust, which is, I can't quite visualize what it is, but as the corpse decomposes, I guess it gets to a stage where it is rotted or dust-like or something. I'm really not sure how to define it or how to visualize it. Nor do I'm not sure I want to visualize it. But anyway, so it's called Rekav in the Mishnah Hebrew. So I'll just use that term. Amarula. Ein Rekav el habamim abasar min agidim min atzamos. Rekav is only what comes from what we presume to be a mixture of flesh, sinews, and bones. So Esri Rabba asked him, Rekav habamim abasar tahar. We have another source that says Rekav that comes from flesh, only flesh, is tahar. So doesn't that imply that if it comes just from bone, then it's tameh? We often go to like a basar, even without flesh. So it's not such a great question. My answer is saying, okay, this is how you should read it. Rekav habamim basar tahar ad sheyesh etzem bebasar. What it means to say is rekav that comes from flesh is tahar unless there's also bone mixed in. So it's not trying to imply anything about like flesh alone doesn't. Saying this rule about flesh alone doesn't imply anything about bone alone. It's simply saying that flesh alone is nothing without bone mixed in as well. But wait a minute, the Gemara says halakha gidim. Wait a second. What we said that there are 3 things required in the mixture in order to make rekav. That's including sinews. So the way you've reread this is only meat, flesh, and bone. What about sinews? Our original source says you need all 3, and here we're only talking about 2. So Gemara says, no, this is just a physical reality. If you have flesh and bone, there's got to be some sinew mixed in. So this is an anatomical question about which I again have no knowledge or basis on which to comment, but the Gemara takes it for granted in this interpretation that if you have flesh and bone, then there's always some sinew present as well. So you can make the statement about flesh and bone and understand that that also means that there's sinew mixed in, and that accords with our original source, which requires all 3. Shmuel says, if you have 2 dead bodies buried together, Nasu Gilgalin Zelazeh, then the rekav that comes from their decomposition, they're like, it's a mixture. In other words, you never have an individual corpse, dust from an individual corpse, because all of the decomposition occurs more or less simultaneously together. And so the implication here is that it does not become tameh, right? That in order to become tameh, it has to be from a single body. So Masir Rav Nassan, so Nassan asks, we have another source, Rekav Abami Beis Mesim, tameh. Rekav that comes from 2 corpses is tameh. So Rava answers the distinction is as follows: Shekabaro is that b'fnei atzmo v'irkivu, is that b'fnei atzmo v'irkivu. There's 2 different cases. If each body was buried separately and got to the stage of rekav, and then the rekav from 2 of them was mixed together, then that's tameh. Okay, because you have an individual rekav from an individual is present. Okay, but beyond the more time rekav, that if those mix together to form the minimum measure, then that's tameh. But if you have 2 bodies buried together, in which the original decomposition was from 2 separate bodies, there was never an independent decomposition of the single body, that's the case in which it is not tameh. Okay, interesting distinction. My camera just collapsed. Just a sec. Okay. Amar Rav Chana said, "Does a sorrow ukavaro imo?" So, if you bury a person who's died and he's buried, so and the hair on his head is part of the body, and the fingernails are part of the body, right? So, any measure of tuma from the decomposition of that body would naturally include hair or whatnot. Okay, but not so. But if you cut the hair first, what if you cut off the hair before burying? So, a person dies, you cut off the hair, bury it together, and then it decomposes. So then nasalo going, then the hair is considered separate. The hair is like a separate body, and the decomposition is of a mixture of two bodies, as it were, and it does not become tame. That's an interesting this kind of case. It's non-hasam. We have another Mishnah. Every part of a dead body is tame, except for the teeth, the hair, and the nails. But if they're still attached to the body, then they're still tame. Okay, so again, we see that the hair is, if it's detached, and same with the nails and what was the other thing, the teeth. If they're detached, then they are considered a separate thing. That, of course, is what we said in the previous state. What if you have a person who died with long hair, and the assumption here is that there's a certain length at which one is definitely needs to cut their hair or is going to cut their hair. Sorry, use my stand here. Different surface. So there's this idea. I mean, there's this underlying idea clearly that, as when I used to get my haircut, my grandfather thought it was still too long. He would say, like, now you need your haircut. Okay, but there's some kind of objective standard of when a person's hair should be cut. So Fiske is asking, so what about that hair? It's still attached to the body, but it's like it needed cutting, right? Or tzipar and home lugaze, the same thing. There's some objective standard of when your nails need to be clipped. Person dies and did not have his nails clipped. The nails were too long. What is the status of those? Do we say that since it is cuttable, right, or it needs to be cut, then we should consider it as a separate thing, in which case it would be considered a separate from the body, and the decomposition would be a mixture that would not become tame. Or Dilma, or do you say no, like it's not cut off, it's still, the hair is still attached to your head, part of your body? Maybe we can resolve this by Rabbi Bar Chana's statement. What Rabbi Bar Chana stated above was, if you cut off the hair, then it's considered a separate body. Hello, Gazas law, but if you didn't cut it, it doesn't count. So Morris is not necessarily, Hakikama is what he could have been saying. Gazas Hari Gilgil. If the hair was cut, then it's certainly a mixture, right? Certainly a separate thing, and mixes with the other body, and it's considered two separate objects. Lo Gazas mi violate. But what he's asking about is he is unsure about whether if it hadn't been cut off. So the fact that he mentioned, if it's cut, then it's considered separate. We cannot deduce that he knew the rule for if it hadn't been cut but needed to be cut. He's unsure about that. So it's, in other words, Umar deems this not a statement from which you can make that conclusion. By Revere may ask, what about Reka that comes from the heel? What's the difference about the heel? So it's a little unclear. Like the skin on the heel is thicker because you walk on it all the time. Calluses form there. Maybe there's maybe more layers of perhaps the dead skin. It's really kind of unclear though. Like why this would be considered separate, to me anyway, or a separate case. But migamrina rekav might be kule maze, the asim ekav lo. So do we say that rekav, generally speaking, when we talk about rekav, is coming from any other part of the body, but not from the heel, because the heel is like a, is considered like a separate, external to your body almost. Or maybe we shouldn't make that distinction. Tashma, let's try and prove it. Tani Rav Nasan Rav Yoshi, Rav Nasan taught, Rekav haba min shnei mesim tameh. Rekav that comes from two dead bodies is tameh. So that's his rule, right? It has to come from two bodies. And he doesn't say anything about the heel, right? But like maybe the heel, even though it comes from your own body, is considered separate. He doesn't say that. So if you think that it's the heel is considered separate, like maybe, even in one body, maybe some of it's coming from the heel. So your answer is no. Not, you can't prove it from that. Maybe it's true. In other words, maybe it's the case that if you have record that comes from a complete body and some of it is heel, then maybe it's not tameh. What Yirmiyah is talking about could be if you have record from one limb, let's say from your arm, so you know that there's no heel in your arm. Now, I might ask the same question about the elbow, but I'm not going to go there. If maybe Rabbi Yirmiyah is asking if you have rekav and you know that none of it came from the heel, it came from a single body, not from the heel, then that's definitely a single body. Then it has to be that is what is considered from a single body. The Gemara says, no, that's not a good way to look at it. Either kafule me sukas derech. One second. Yeah. So then what is the question of Rabbi Yirmiyah is when there's only one limb that the rekav came from and does not include the but if it does include dust from the heel, whether do we consider the heel from a separate body or not? So that we don't know the answer. Where Rabbi Yirmiyah adds further, Ubar b'mei isha. What if a woman dies and she's pregnant? So what is the status of the fetus? Is it considered part of the same body with regard to this rekav rule or not? Or is it a separate body? On one hand, we have a principle that the fetus is a limb, as it were, a limb of the mother. It's part of the mother. So so it's part of her body. So the rekav that comes from this is not a mixture. It's considered part of the mother's body. So it's a single body. Or maybe Kevin the sofa says, like, yes, it's part of her body, but it is something that is not intended, but it's known to be something that would have separated from the body. In other words, the fetus is ultimately going to separate from the mother. Mifresh parashmines, and then maybe for the purposes of this rule of rekav, maybe it should be considered a separate being. V'intim salomar ubar the sofa says mifresh parashmina, and even if you say that it's considered a separate being because it's ultimately going to separate. What if a woman dies and she has semen inside her? Okay, so this is something that is below itzar, since hasn't formed yet into a fetus, right, into an embryo. So it should be considered like her body. It's a part of her body. Dilma, Kevin de Mayoma costs low, or maybe it hasn't reached that stage yet. It is a foreign substance that's being absorbed by her body. But in the meantime, until it's fertilized, let's say, or I guess is absorbed or expelled by the body, maybe it's considered a foreign substance, and then it would contribute to a mixture of two. The rekav would be from two different sources and not tummy? Again, we don't have an answer to it. Fire of Papa, Perishamahu. What about undigested food? Okay, in your stomach or intestines. What about that? Is that considered a separate substance or is it part of your body? Since a person can't eat or can't survive without eating, so therefore the food would be considered part of your body because it's necessary for your existence. So it's a kind of a vital organ in a sense. Dilma, maybe Hanabi may almost say, or no, we say not so. You could easily argue with that principle. You could say, yes, a person has to eat, but they didn't have to eat this apple, right? This apple is not, a vital organ, as it were. Could have eaten a banana instead, or skipped the meal. So in that case, it should still be considered a foreign substance. Again, no answer. Ravacha asks, Oromahu, what about the skin? Why is the skin different? There is a view that skin of the corpse does not make you come out. It's only we usually talk about the flesh, the bones, the sinews, as we saw before. But what about the skin? Is that considered separate or not? What about saliva and mucus? Right? Is that considered separate, or is that part of your body? So, the way we're going here is, as you can see, we're kind of chipping away at this whole idea of reckoning, right? Because like these, everybody has mucus, and if you're going to say that that's considered separate from your body, then you'd never have reckon, right? So we're kind of chipping away at the whole idea. Shmuel said, so all of these, this is what I'm getting at. If all of these things, undigested food, semen, mucus, if all of these things are considered external from your body, everybody has one of these things, right? You'd never have Rekav. Why are you even talking about Rekav if you're going to exclude every practical possibility? More answers, you can have a theoretical possibility of Rekav. The Ashkieh made the kalim, if before the person died, he drank this made the kalim, which is some kind of a purgative that clears out all of the food from your undigested food from your intestines and all your mucus and spit. It completely dries you out. The Sachyanasha, and he had a depilatory on his whole body, so there was no hair. Ushalako made Tiberia, and this is really weird. I'm not sure if this is meant to be before or after the death, but you basically cook the body in hot springs, okay, to remove the skin. So, in other words, there is a theoretical possibility that a person could be buried without skin, without mucus, without undigested food, without any foreign substance, and that would be the theoretical case where there could be Reka. But clearly we're kind of minimizing the possibility of ever applying this law. Okay, so moving on to different topics. Amarabai, Netina Mesha Tuchano Ein Lo Reka. A body that was ground up. Okay, I don't even want to imagine the circumstances of this, but whatever. The body was ground up before burial. Ein Lo Reka. There's no the rules of Reka do not apply. The Bible they asked Tuchano v'Chazar v'Hirkiv Mahu. What if it did decay? If it was ground up and it still produced Reka. Mide hutama eladika basar v'ginin vatsamos. Like, why would you say that there's no Reka? I mean, the source of this organic material is still bones, flesh, and sinews, right? The fact that it was ground up doesn't really affect that. The organic material is the same. And if it produces Reka, it produces Reka. Or maybe the rule is that the Reka only counts if it's generated while the body is still intact. And that's not the case here. So we don't know. So there's a lot we don't know about Rekav, as you can see. Tani Ula Barshem, Ulata, Mesh Shachasar Ein Lo Rekav. A body that's missing a limb or some significant part does not produce Rekav. Below Tefusa, and it also doesn't have so there's a couple of laws about when you find a dead body in a place that's not known to be a cemetery. So Tfusa has to be with moving a body. So if the body is buried and you want to exhume it and move it somewhere else, you have to take some of the surrounding dirt with it. And Shkunas Kavaros is how you determine if you find a body in a place that is not known to be a cemetery. If you find 3 bodies together, then you have to assume that it is a cemetery you just didn't know about. But if you only find 1 or 2 bodies, you can assume that it's a random occurrence, like somebody died there and was buried there, but you don't have to worry about the surrounding area being a source of tuma. In all of these 3 rules, Rekav, removing the body together with some surrounding earth, or determining if this is one of at least 3 bodies buried or found in the same place. If such a body is missing a limb, it doesn't count. So for example, like, why does this make sense? So in the case of finding bodies together, if you find a body that is missing a limb, then you can assume that something, some accident occurred here. A person was attacked by an animal, let's say, or something, and that's why there's no limb there. And the fact that the body is buried there doesn't indicate that other bodies were buried there, right? It's just a random occurrence. Okay, so make sure. So they asked, Lo imamarta b'meis sheyesh lo rova omalo tarvad rekav. About a body that that makes you tame. It has the rules of it has to be a majority of the body, and it has to be a minimum amount of bones, a quarter of a cob, or a ladleful of rekav. So Tomer B'chai She'en Lo Larova V'Lo Tarvad. What are you going to say about a living person, like about if you have a measure of flesh from a living person, does that also make you tameh? So Hechidame, the Irkav Chadev. We're talking about, in the case of Rekav, 1 limb was decayed into Rekav. The Kavase Gabe Meis, Afilu Chadev or Ika Rekav. So the corresponding case for a dead person would be even 1 limb would produce Rekav, but that contradicts what Ula says. But Ula says that Rekav from an incomplete corpse, like 1 limb, would not produce Rekav, but by comparison to since we know that Rekav can be produced from the severed limb of a living person, it doesn't correspond, right? So Gemara says, Mika Tane Tame. So the Mishnah doesn't say, however, like doesn't talk about, it doesn't say however a dead person, a dead body. What it's trying to say is that, not comparing the two, but that like any dead body produces rekav, any severed limb from a live person or severed flesh or whatever does not produce rekav. No, and you can't take it any further than that. Why Rava asked, you have a limb that produces rekav while you're still alive. And then you die, right? No. What about the rekav? Kigamiri rekav irkiv kishu meis. Does rekav only apply when it's after death? Or dilma hashamiyam pamayis? Or is it rekav from your organic material, and then once you die, that becomes becomes Matame, which is a little difficult to see. Like, I'm not sure what that side of the inquiry is. It seems to me like it seems kind of intuitive that Rekav is produced from a dead body. That's what makes you Tame. Rekav that's produced from a live body or a limb of a live person. Either it is or it isn't Tame. When the person dies afterwards, it shouldn't seem to have, to me, it doesn't seem like it would have any application to previously severed material. But this is what the Gemara wants to inquire. So Tashma, let's see if we can prove it. Lo imamarta b'mei sheish l'rogo militav rekav. If you say about a dead body that a kazayas of flesh makes you tamei and can produce rekav,
Call me early in the morning.
Tomer b'chai, tam mishum chai. The reason is because it's alive. But if you were dead, you would produce rekav, even though it decayed during lifetime. So one answer is you can't determine that from the language of the Mishnah. It doesn't state it as saying like therefore, or alternatively, or what's the word I mean for, like conversely or whatever. It doesn't say that. It says it's just referring to that a dead body produces rekav, a live one does not produce rekav. So you can't make any conclusions about what if the person died after. Okay, now completely shifting gears. Tangential to the idea of losing a limb, we're going to discuss the rules about forbidden foods. So you can't eat a sheretz, right? You can't eat a creepy crawly creature. We're going to talk about an ant. However, and there's a shear, right? There's a minimum quantity of how much of the minimum you need to eat in order to be liable. However, there's a rule that if you eat an entire being, even if it's smaller than the usual shear, you're still liable. Okay, so take the case of an ant. An ant is very small, smaller than the minimum shear. But if you consume an entire ant, you're still liable. Okay, so Rava asked in the Malash, what if you have an ant that's missing a leg, right? Shear Gemirla. So is the full ant considered the shear? And so is it looked at in the same way as we look at the shear as a minimum measure? And therefore, if it's missing a leg, it's less than the shear, it's less than the full being. It's missing. Or maybe the ant missing a leg is still a complete creature, right? It's not, so it's defective in some way, but it's still a living ant, right? So the fact that it's missing a leg shouldn't affect the fact that you're still consuming a complete creature and it's still forbidden. So you had answered Tashma. Let's prove it from here. Bahem. So there's two verses about eating a sheretz, one after another. One uses the word kol nogeh bahem b'mo. So I think this is the case of becoming tame. If you touch one of them that is dead, and use the word bahem, any of them, then you become tame. And the next verse says, kol she'yipol mehem b'mo samitma. And anything which falls on one of them, or from them, right? So it uses both of these terms. Yachol b'kulan. So it might mean that like bahem might imply that it has to be a complete creature. So the Torah uses the other word mayhem, from them, meaning an incomplete creature. So maybe mayhem implies that any part, no matter how small, any part of the sheretz makes you tame. So therefore, you have the other word bahem. In other words, it has to be a full creature. So how do you resolve this? Okay, so what makes you tame is a part. Obviously, a full creature makes you tame, but even a part of the creature which is equivalent to the whole. So let's say large enough to be considered like the whole. The shiur chachamim b'chadasha. How large is that? A lentil size. And why a lentil size? The smallest sheretz is a chomet, whatever that is. Maybe a kind of snail or lizard, but whatever it is. When it's born, its smallest size when it's born is the size of a lentil. So shiur gemirah. So therefore, what we're going to say is any sheretz, any piece of any sheretz that is at least as big as a lentil, which is the size of the smallest full sheretz, that's what makes you tameh. So doesn't that indicate that that when we consider a full creature like that, you're liable for consuming a full creature, it is a shiur, right? It falls under the definition of how big is it, right? Because this whole discussion of, how big a piece of a sheretz, as big as the piece of the smallest fully living sheretz, indicates that we're viewing it as a shiur and not as not necessarily as a complete creature. Shmaya says not necessarily. Ki be'in shiura. When do we need a minimum shiur? Bidlo havya kadasha lo metame. If only if it's in determining the law of how big the piece has to be. It's not as big as the minimum sheretz size. Because anything smaller than that cannot live. Any sheretz smaller than that cannot live. This is the minimum size of a living sheretz. But once you have a sheretz that has acquired life, right, a living sheretz, even the ant missing the leg, well, maybe we don't need a shiur anymore. Maybe the fact that it's already alive qualifies it to be forbidden. So tibayla. So it's still an open question. And this is where we'll stop for today. And I remind you that tomorrow, David's traveling and I'm traveling. David will be recording tomorrow's daf, and I guess it will be made available by email or something, or through the WhatsApp group, but we will not be having a live shiur tomorrow.
Thank you, Dov. Everyone have a good day. Thank you again.
You too. Bye.